Could all witnesses please turn their cameras on? Thank you.
Subcommittee will come to order. I ask unanimous consent that the chair be authorized to declare recess at any time during today's hearing. Without objection, so ordered. I also ask unanimous consent that members not on the subcommittee be permitted to sit with the subcommittee at today's hearing and ask questions. Without objection, so ordered. As a reminder, please keep your microphone muted unless speaking. Should I hear any inadvertent background noise, I will request that the member please mute his or her microphone. To insert a document into the record, please have your staff email it to documentstni@mail.house.gov. So let me begin. I want to welcome to today's hearing examining the role, I want to welcome all to today's hearing examining the role of ferries in mobility. While the Subcommittee on Highways and Transit currently oversees 2 ferry programs, one under the Federal Highways Administration and one under the Federal Transit Administration, this is the first hearing the subcommittee has ever held on ferry transportation. This is a historic hearing, and given climate control issues, it could not be more apt. Our transportation system is facing significant challenges: traffic gridlock that wastes time and money, inequality and lack of accessibility, a changing climate that causes severe storms and increasing flooding, and serving as the #1 source of greenhouse gas emissions. There is no silver bullet to solving these problems, but providing more transportation choices is a step in the right direction. One of my priorities as subcommittee chair has been ensuring that we consider innovative and varied modes of transportation, whether improved public transit, new approaches to micromobility, such as scooters, or utilizing our waterways to move people. Here in the DC metropolitan area, we face some of the worst traffic congestion in the country. A 2017 study by the traffic data firm Entrant found that the worst traffic hotspot in the country was along Interstate 95 between Fairfax County Parkway and Fredericksburg, Virginia. One of our witnesses, Principe, represents a coalition looking to expand ferry service along that very corridor, which could help to improve that traffic bottleneck and provide more transportation options. We know that we cannot solve congestion by simply building more highway lanes. In many congestion areas, more roads simply mean more traffic. That means we need to pursue alternatives, including expanded ferry service. Ferries also have the potential to help us reduce carbon pollution. While passenger cars and light-duty trucks account for 58% of U.S. transportation greenhouse emissions, ships and boats account for just 2%. Shifting more trips from highways to waterways holds great promise for reducing our carbon footprint. It can also reduce other forms of air pollution, including smog, that causes asthma attacks, heart attacks, and other adverse health outcomes. While maritime modes of transportation like ferries are among the cleanest transportation options already, their emissions can be reduced even further as operators begin converting their fleets to hybrid, electric, or alternative fuels. I look forward to hearing from witnesses today about their efforts toward fleet conversion. Ferry service not only provides an important transportation option, it also represents an investment in our communities. It can be a catalyst for revitalization, expanding access to to small businesses and community centers, and bolstering the local economy. As we work to build transportation system that is better, more innovative, sustainable, and equitable, we must ensure that the federal government is a strong partner for those operating ferry service and those who wish to launch new routes. That means providing funding options through our federal programs and doing the research and data collection needed to guide these investments. I thank each of our witnesses for joining us today and look forward to your testimony. I'm pleased to ask our ranking member, Mr. Davis, for an opening statement.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Great to see you, great to be here, and a really great issue to address. I do want to welcome everybody to today's hearing on the role of ferries in improving mobility. I especially want to welcome Kyle Godar, the county engineer from Calhoun County, Illinois. Mr. Godar is my constituent and has been working with my office to resolve an issue that Calhoun County, which is a county that is a peninsula that sits between the Illinois and Mississippi rivers, but they have a problem utilizing its ferry boat program funding. My hope at this hearing is to draw attention to this problem so that we can finally get the Federal Highway Administration and the Army Corps of Engineers to come together to find a solution. At this time, Madam Chair, I'd ask unanimous consent to submit for the record my letter that I sent to both agencies 5.5 months ago requesting coordinated technical assistance in resolving this issue.
So ordered.
And 5.5 months is a long time, and it's pretty frustrating when we don't get responses from the federal agencies that we send letters to. I would ask, if we continue to not get responses, Madam Chair, if you and I can maybe do a joint letter to let these agencies know. We just appreciate a response.
I would be happy to join the ranking member in such a letter.
Thank you very much. Under current law, this subcommittee authorizes 2 programs that provide federal funds for ferry transportation. The Ferry Boat Discretionary Program is administered by the Federal Highway Administration, and the Passenger Ferry Grant Program is administered by the Federal Transit Administration. The Senate's bipartisan infrastructure bill includes 2 new ferry boat programs and grows ferry program funding, the funding levels from $550 million to $2.3 billion. Ferries serve diverse areas of our country, much like our highway and bridge network, from urban to coastal areas to rural America. As I mentioned earlier, I have a ferry in my district that actually, multiple ferries that operate from Illinois across the Mississippi River to Missouri. And also, we have ferries that operate intrastate between Greene County and Jersey County, Illinois, over to Calhoun. And that's what Mr. Godar is here to discuss. The importance of that ferry to the community it serves cannot be understated, which is why it is so important to resolve Mr. Godar's issues. While ferry service certainly is not a solution for each state, it is important to understand the role ferries play in quickly connecting people and communities through water crossings. It's also important to understand the needs of ferry boat and facility owners and operators. Addressing these needs, as those here before us today will testify, is critical to improving our ferry operations. I look forward to hearing about ferry ridership, technological innovations, and challenges ahead and proposed solutions identified in implementing ferry boat programs. With that, I want to thank our witnesses for joining us this morning, and I look forward to hearing their testimony. I yield back.
I thank my good friend for his opening statement. I would now like to welcome our witnesses on our panel. Ms. Patty Rubstello, Assistant Secretary for Ferries, Washington State Department of Transportation. Mr. Sheamus Murphy, Executive Director, San Francisco Bay Area Emergency Transportation Authority. The Honorable Frank Principe, Chair M495 Regional Commuter Ferry Group, and Mr. Kyle Godar, County Engineer, Calhoun County Highway Department. I want to thank each of you for being here, and I look forward to your testimony. Without objection, our witnesses' full testimony will be included in the record. Since your written testimony has been made a part of the record, the subcommittee requests that you submit your oral testimony for 5 minutes. Let us proceed with Ms. Rubstello. You may proceed.
Chairwoman Norton, Ranking Member Davis, and distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today to share information about Washington State Ferry System. My name is Patty Rubstello, and I serve as Assistant Secretary at Washington State Department of Transportation, leading the Ferry Division. WashDOT operates Washington State Ferries, the nation's largest ferry system, which is a transit system, a part of the Washington State Highway System, and a vessel and terminal operator. We work with many federal agencies, including Federal Highway Administration, Federal Transit Administration, U.S. Maritime Administration, and U.S. Coast Guard. We value our federal partnership and want to thank the committee for the critical funding support that allows us to provide this critical service. I'd like to share a graphic of our system. We transport nearly 24 million customers per year on 10 routes, served by a fleet of 21 vessels. We operate and maintain 20 terminals. We also have agreements with 2 counties who provide passenger-only ferry service utilizing our facilities. Ridership on Washington State ferries is expected to grow by 30% by 2040, climbing to nearly 32 million passengers a year. For Western Washington, ferries plays an important role in mobility, connecting urban areas with rural and affordable communities and our islands that are completely dependent on our service. Often the drive around option for many travelers means several hours on highways and local roads compared to a relatively brief ferry trip. One of our busiest commuter routes, the ferry between Bainbridge Island and downtown Seattle, transports over 3 million walk-on passengers a year. Many of these customers connect to other forms of transit on each side of the water, reaching their destination without the use of single occupant vehicles. While federal funding, which comprises about approximately 25% of our capital and operating budget, has been critical to maintaining and operating our services and facilities, we need additional resources to preserve and modernize our aging fleet and infrastructure. Over the next 20 years, 13 of Washington's ferries will need to be replaced. Additionally, increased number of relief or standby vessels are required to ensure reliable service. The estimated cost of all of this over the next 20 years is $14.6 billion. Dedicated state tax revenue and fare collection would cover $7.7 billion of these costs. Given that so many of our older diesel vessels are due for replacement in the near future, this is an opportunity or an opportune time to electrify our fleet. Washington State Ferries, a diesel fuel consumption makes it the largest generator of carbon and other greenhouse gas emissions for Washington State government sources. So we're moving toward a zero emission fleet. Our near-term plan is to convert our 3 largest vessels to hybrid electric. Their hybridization coupled with installation of shoreside charging will reduce fleet-wide emission by 27%, the equivalent of taking more than 10,000 cars off the road. We estimate the fully hybrid fleet would reduce our energy consumption by 30%, saving us $19 million per year in operating costs. I want to acknowledge and thank Congressman Larson for his longstanding support of Washington State Ferries, in particular his commitment to the ferry electrification. We are pleased to see electric ferry program in both the Invest Act and in the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. Operating a ferry system has its challenges. The impact of that pandemic and the global shortage of mariners has led to extraordinary service challenges. At the lowest point of the pandemic, our ridership has fallen 75%, with walk-on riders were down nearly 90%. As nearly 75% of our operating budget is derived from fares, our budget was significantly impacted. I want to thank Congress for the federal relief funding we received via the FTA transit programs to help cover some of those operating loss. This funding ensured that we could maintain our critical services, including getting essential workers to their jobs, lifeline access to island communities. We're slowly seeing ridership increase while some routes over the summer return to pre-pandemic levels, others are still lagging. The pandemic also exacerbated workforce shortages, retirements, limited training class size due to social distancing requirements, and global shortage of mariners has made hiring enough qualified staff even more difficult. We're working diligently to provide the right level of service while constantly communicating with our customers about the impact. As nation's largest ferry system, we strive to be a leader for sustainable growth, reducing congestion on roads, embracing new, greener technology while providing safe and reliable service. We appreciate and depend on Congress's support for this work. Thank you again for the honor and opportunity to testify today, and I'm happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Robstello. Next, Mr. Sheamus Murphy.
Thank you, Chair Norton, Ranking Member Davis, and members of the subcommittee. I'm Sheamus Murphy, Executive Director of the San Francisco Bay Area Water Emergency Transportation Authority. Thank you for the opportunity to speak about San Francisco Bay Ferry service, our efforts to recover from the pandemic, plans for expansion, and our transition to zero emissions technology. WITA is a regional public transit agency in the Bay Area that carries over 3 million passengers a year aboard 15 high-speed passenger-only ferry vessels. Prior to the pandemic, San Francisco Bay Ferry was the region's fastest growing transit service. Between 2013 and 2019, demand for ferry service increased over 160%, including 35% growth from 2019 to 2020. Of course, like every other travel mode, all of that changed with COVID. WITA's ridership is historically commute-based, and most of them were able to transition immediately to remote work. Ridership initially dropped by 98% and remained between 7% and 12% of pre-COVID levels for the next 16 months. WITA reduced service to reflect that demand, but the system is highly fare dependent, so our ability to maintain even a minimum service level for essential workers is extremely limited. Thankfully, Congress took action. On behalf of our riders, deckhands, pilots, and countless Americans who depended on essential workers to get us through the darkest days of the pandemic, thank you for everything Congress did to maintain transit as an essential service. Without that support, thousands of nurses, teachers, grocery clerks, construction workers, and others not able to work from home would have been stranded without a mobility option. We use funding from those programs to invest in saving jobs, preserving services, and protecting the most vulnerable members of our communities. We're incredibly grateful. Thanks to these funds, in July, WITA became the first regional system in the Bay Area to fully restore service. In addition to relaunching service, we also lowered fares to align with other transit modes, and we shifted more service to the off-peak to accommodate the needs of lower-income transit-dependent workers. After implementing these changes, WITA ridership nearly doubled overnight and has significantly outpaced other regional carriers. Congestion has fully returned to regional highways, and based on job and population growth in the area, there's a high likelihood that our system will eventually return to the level of growth we saw pre-COVID. Before the pandemic, we were working with communities throughout the region to aggressively plan for expansion, and as congestion has returned, communities are once again calling for more service. New neighborhoods are rapidly emerging along the bayfront. These are vibrant population and job centers with extremely congested access via surface streets. Water-based transit will be critical. Our expansion plans will ensure that these emerging economic centers are connected, reducing regional congestion and providing people of all income levels with access to jobs, healthcare, entertainment, and other opportunities. As we prepare to grow, we're also advancing plans to grow sustainably with an eye towards reducing greenhouse gas emissions. WITA has always been an environmental leader in developing clean vessel technology. From the beginning, WITA pushed for new diesel engine technology that exceeded EPA standards. But we believe we can go even further. With that in mind, WITA is developing plans that will transition about 50% of our fleet to zero emissions. The cost of these improvements is being evaluated. We know that aside from the cost of the vessels themselves, significant investment will be needed to equip our terminals with shoreside charging infrastructure that supports a high volume, high frequency system. All of these objectives, making ferry service more accessible, expanding our service to other parts of the bay, and converting our fleet to zero emissions, will require new investment. Our agency has access to local, regional, and state matching funds, but a robust federal program is essential. The current level of funding available through the FTA program that supports ferries pales in comparison to the needs that exist around the country, let alone in the Bay Area. This committee has long recognized this, and we've appreciated the committee's leadership on making more funding available for public ferry systems. There was bipartisan support for increasing the level of funding for the FTA program to $1.25 billion over 5 years as a part of the infrastructure bill in the Senate. That funding increase was set to be added to the bill before it was rushed out of the Senate. That level of investment would provide the resources needed to support this essential mode of transit around the country, and it would allow us at WIDA to fulfill a very ambitious and necessary set of plans for growing ferry service in a sustainable way. We encourage you to find a way to add that funding to the program moving forward. Doing so will allow us to meet the goals that we know are shared by so many on this committee. Again, thank you for the opportunity to testify before you today. Look forward to answering any questions you may have.
Thank you for your testimony, Mr. Murphy. Next, the Honorable Frank Principe.
Good morning, Madam Chairman, Ranking Member, and members of the committee. My name is Frank Principe. I am a former local elected official from Prince William County, Virginia, and serve as the chairman of the Northern Virginia Regional Commission's M495 Fast Ferry Stakeholder Group. The NVRC is a regional planning council of 13 local governments in the Northern Virginia suburbs of Washington, D.C. And the Fast Ferry Stakeholder Group is comprised of more than 60 public, private, and military organizations that have come together to support the launch of fast ferry service in the National Capital Region. Today, people in this region waste an average of 102 hours stuck in traffic annually, translating into a $4.6 billion in lost time and fuel. Our transit services in this region are time and place limited and/or at capacity. Diversification is key to improving mobility in this region. The ability to move goods and people at relatively low cost represents a substantial benefit for both our economy and our quality of life. Our vision is to provide safe, reliable, and efficient passenger ferry transit service on the Occoquan, Potomac, and Anacostia rivers. These waterways, designated as the M495 Marine Highway by MARAD, will meet the needs of residents, tourists, and small freight. The system would be supported with a local commercial vessel maintenance and repair facility as well. Rider amenities will be substantial, and passenger fares are expected to be competitive with existing transit service and less than the cost of our toll lanes. The envisioned service will serve both the north-south and cross-river commutes with a fleet of 149 passenger vessels. The service will enhance fairness and mobility and will provide critical transportation links for areas currently underserved by transit and connect residents to new job centers. The service will include destinations in Virginia, like the Pentagon, National Airport, Amazon HQ2 at National Landing, and in Maryland at Indian Head, National Harbor, and MGM Grand Hotel. And in the District of Columbia, Joint Base Anacostia Bowling, the new headquarters for the Department of Homeland Security, the Wharf, and in the future, Poplar Point. At full development, our system could provide mobility for 10,000 daily regional trips with shorter travel times. Given the significant and growing waterfront population densities and recent efforts to provide customers with near real-time package delivery, the service has the potential to improve freight mobility and provide revenues to support passenger service. The fleet of vessels could also provide the region with expanded emergency management capacity, including water rescues and evacuations. We estimate primary job creation in the range of 100 to 200 jobs initially. The stakeholder group has endorsed the principle that the construction and operation of this new transit service should be conducted through a public-private military partnership. All partners would be expected to help finance the startup costs and participate in the governance structure. It is important to include the military as their personnel make up 24% of our daily commuters in this region. Starting this new service requires substantial upfront investment. Despite our best efforts, the $17 million of federal funds that were in the pipeline for this project have not materialized. We are asking the committee to reconsider our $13 million earmark request sponsored by Madam Chair. The stakeholder group was willing to finance a 40% match of this amount. And our FTA grant of $4.2 million was awarded and later rescinded. This amount, together with an operating subsidy that was authorized in HR 2, would have enabled us to launch. Given that the M495 fast ferry service would quantitatively improve our throughput and provide long-term congestion relief, ferry service would be a great example of building back better here in the National Capital Region. Thank you again for your continued leadership on our country's infrastructure needs, and respectfully ask the committee to consider support of M495. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Principe. Finally, we will hear from Mr. Kyle Godar.
Hello, and I would like to thank the committee for the opportunity to testify today. I'm honored to represent my community, the surrounding region, and similar communities across the country. As you said, my name is Kyle Godar, and I'm the county engineer for Calhoun County, Illinois. As a county engineer, I manage the county highway department as well as the county unit road district, oversee 300 miles of roadway, including 2 ferry terminals. Calhoun County's unique geographical location between the Mississippi River and the Illinois River at the confluence of the rivers leaves the county nearly surrounded by water. Calhoun County lies between Alton, Illinois, which is part of the St. Louis metropolitan area, and Louisiana, Missouri. This is an 80-mile section of the Mississippi River without a bridge crossing to the west, and with the Illinois River to the east. The surrounding area relies on 4 ferry operations to provide mobility through the region. Although Calhoun County is in very close proximity to the St. Louis metro area, it remains a rural community because it is isolated by the rivers from the urban sprawl and expansion of the metro area. This barrier between urban and rural communities that the river creates has historically provided a natural barrier which has preserved the entire area's natural resources and historic sites. This has protected the area's 20 wildlife management areas, 18 public access areas, 40,000 acres of protected enhanced wildlife habitat managed by Pere Marquette State Park, Two Rivers National Wildlife Refuge, the Mississippi River State Fish and Wildlife Area, in addition to the area encompassed by the rivers themselves, and all of the privately owned farms, orchards, wineries that provide locally grown produce to the metro area. The 4 ferries that operate at Grafton, Golden Eagle, Brussels, and Campsville provide the connection that allows those from the metropolitan area to visit, enjoy, and learn about the natural resources in the area. The 4 ferries not only serve to support tourism, but the majority of the passengers carried by the ferries are commuters who utilize the ferry system to drastically reduce the number of miles traveled during their commute. At the Golden Eagle location alone, nearly 600 vehicles each day are commuters. By utilizing the ferry, these commuters are able to reduce their commute from a one-way 80-mile trip on some of the most congested roads in the area to a 30-mile average trip across some of the least traveled roads in the area. Using ferries greatly reduces the congestion and the miles traveled. The Golden Eagle ferry alone results in an annual reduction of nearly 8 million miles traveled, Two of the ferries have also been repowered by CMAQ funds, helping reduce emissions. And although the topic of the hearing is mobility, I think it's important to understand the life, health, and safety needs that the ferries provide as well. Access to healthcare is an intrinsic need and is only accessible to some by way of ferry. The absence, of reliable ferry service could deny residents in this area life needs, even access to food at times. All four of the ferries servicing Calhoun County have had funding made available through allocation through the ferry boat program. Unfortunately, guidance provided by FHWAs and some of the eligibility requirements associated with those funds has rendered the county unable to use the funds as needed. Specifically, in one case, the ineligibility of approach roadways becomes a major issue for us. Given the wide range of ferry services, characteristics, and ownership structures that exist, a one-size-fits-all approach to the ferry boat funding guidance has resulted in many ferry services allowing allotted funds to expire, including ours. Eliminating some of these eligibility issues, especially when associated to, for instance, the one-time discretionary funds that I believe are included in the current Senate bill, would help secure public ownership of associated facilities, secure public control of these facilities would greatly improve the reliability of the ferry service and the federal aid system of highways. I thank you again for the opportunity to bring these issues to your attention, and I'm open to answering any questions you may have.
Thank you very much, Mr. Goldbar. We will now move to member questions. Each member will be recognized for 5 minutes, and I will start by asking my own questions. Mr. Principe, your testimony noted challenges in this very region, the National Capital Region, with drivers spending 100 hours more each year stuck in traffic. Now, we're fortunate in the DC metropolitan region to have waterways. Not every region has such waterways. Can you provide more detail on the level of ridership you anticipate the M495 ferry system could serve, and what the corresponding impact on traffic congestion might be?
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. As I said in the testimony, we would expect at startup to be able to carry about 10,000 daily passengers, which would equate to a little over 3 million passengers annually, and be able to grow from there. The network, it's amazing. This region has so many military bases on those river systems. We have so many transit-oriented developments on those regions that the sky's the limit with the ability to be able to use our last unused blue highways to accommodate the, and vis-a-vis traffic congestion, I don't think we'll ever get to pandemic levels on the interstates. I think we're going to, go back to what it was before in large measure. But congestion, it would, in effect, be able to slow down the large amount of money being invested in roads and other transit systems, because I believe very strongly that investments in ferry service is much more efficient than perhaps bus or even commuter rail.
Yeah, I anticipate when people know that you can get on a boat and get here just as fast, that you will find those alternatives increasingly thriving. Mr. Principe, one of our goals here in the District of Columbia is to invest in these and revitalize our waterfront communities. We're very fortunate to have one of my bills that passed the Southwest waterfront, another, the Southeast waterfront. So we're already revitalizing our waterfronts. Mr. Principe, how would M495 ferry service help our region build build a thriving and accessible waterfront community?
Well, by definition, successful waterfront communities require transit, that it be transit-oriented development. And while there may be bus service and perhaps rail in a few areas in those centers, all of them are connected by our three rivers. And so being able to move individuals, either be commuters or tourists, between and among those transit-oriented developments would be huge from an economic development standpoint here in our region, not only on jobs, but on tax revenue for government and quite in fact, quality of life issues for the riders. You know, there's nothing better than to be sitting in a reclining leather seat, you know, with a beautiful stress-free view of the waterway system, as my colleagues are able to accomplish. We'd like to do that here in the National Capital Region as well.
Thank you. Mr. Obstello, your testimony highlights the workforce challenges the Washington State Ferry system faces. Staggering number of your highly skilled employees eligible for retirement. In the Invest in American Act, the committee dedicated significant resources to ensure transit workers will be well trained to keep up with that changing sector. Are there federal resources you can draw upon as you tackle your workforce needs?
Well, we're currently already using those resources that we have. Part of the challenge is attracting new talent and then being able to train them quickly enough to get them onto the vessels and part of the operations team. So it's really about bringing that attraction that these are good paying wages, good family wage jobs, and then of course our service. So we're utilizing everything that we already have.
Well, that's very pleasing to note, and I thank you. And now ask my good friend, the ranking member, for his questions.
Thank you again, Madam Chair, and thank you again to the witnesses. Great to hear your opening testimony. I want to start with my witness, Mr. Godar. We've heard a lot today about the need for increased funding, but you have an issue where you actually don't need any more funding. You just need government to do their job and be able to use the federal funds you have for a specific purpose. Can you explain in more detail the project you're attempting to complete and would complete if it weren't for pushback from the federal government?
Yes, and I don't know that we would turn down extra funding, as we would look, we would appreciate that, but if you give me funding I can't use, it doesn't help. So in this situation, our local ferry operation at Golden Eagle started out like many as a private operation, how most of these river ferries in our area began. And over time, these ferries have either been replaced by bridges or in strategic locations have slowly been modified from private ownership to public ownership, or a combination public-private partnership, which is the case in this situation. At this location in, I think, 1969, IDOT eminent domained the terminal on the Illinois side, as there was some conflicts with property owners there, and bestowed the power of managing the ferry onto the county. No such issue has ever taken place on the Missouri side of the Mississippi, and the terminal is on U.S. Army Corps of Engineers land, and there is a gap from there to the next closest federal aid route that's managed by MoDOT. And our ferry operator still owns a small piece of property and the roadway that connects the two. And given the ferry boat funds, we were hoping to improve that section of road, which is in dire need of it, but have been told that it does not does not qualify because it's not in the system.
Can you give us a brief example of some of the benefits that if this project were to be completed, that would come to Calhoun County and southwestern Illinois?
Yeah, so improvement to this road, and it would be a simple fix to improve the road and raise a section of it from 2 feet to 6 inches. That would offer an additional 60 days of operating time on average per year where the road is inundated by floodwaters. Route B is still open, we just cannot make the connection. That closes this ferry operation down, which reduces traffic, increases congestion. And, you know, the ferry company has repowered 2 of their tugs with lower emission engines through CMAQ funds in the past. I think they'd be greatly interested in looking into purchasing new tugs. They need to right now that they don't have the funding to purchase. But with electrification and these other changes, I think that they would be interested in pursuing that. But here with this smaller operation, we're lacking the funds to match those type of federal investments. So I think at our smaller operations like that, they're going to need additional support just to be able to do those things, even if a lot of the federal funds because of lack of matching funds. You know, and back to the road issue, I think I need to have federal FHWA, IDOT, and MoDOT come together and provide Calhoun County with a funding source that they'll allow us to utilize to acquire what needs to be a public right-of-way to solidify this very important ferry connection. And I think that wraps up most of our issues we're having.
Great, thank you. And I'd be interested in hearing from any of the other witnesses at some point if you have any permitting issues with how long permitting takes. But I do want to briefly say something to Ms. Rubistello. Ms. Rubistello, you mentioned workforce. You may not be aware, a lot of folks aren't aware, as part of the CARES Act, Congress actually passed a provision that allows employers to pay down student debt, just like they were able to do with a tax, with a $5,250 limit for the employee not to have to pay taxes on that's the same thing that existed with tuition reimbursement. Employers can now pay down student debt up to that level tax-free for their employees or future employees. It's a great recruitment, great retention tool. I would urge, and you don't have to fill out a grant program to get the money. It's utilizing our tax code to help encourage employers to attack the student loan debt problem in this country in a voluntary private sector approach. So I would urge you to reach out to our office. We'll get you the information on it. I think it can really help address some of the workforce issues right now in your industry. And I yield back, Madam Chair.
Well, I thank the ranking member for his questions. And I now recognize Mr. Series for 5 minutes. Mr. Series, you're recognized.
Well, thank you very much for holding this hearing. You know, my district, being one of the most congested districts in the country, being so close to New York, having the Hudson River, we have a number of ferry stations. And quite frankly, if it wasn't for the assistance of the federal government, we'd be even more congested. We have tied the ferry ports to a light rail, where the light rail brings people to the ferry and the ferry goes into New York, obviously. It only takes about 7 minutes to get across the river, but people save quite a bit of time. But the most important part is that you have all those cars taken off the road. Between the light rail and the ferry, there's a number of cars that are taken off the road every single day. The other part that it helps with the ferry is When 9/11 happened, the only people that could get out of New York because everything else was closed was through the ferry. Every time there's an emergency, the ferries are there to assist. If you remember when Captain Scully landed on the Hudson River, the first people who were there to assist in that accident was the ferry system. So that's another plus for the ferries in areas, hopefully that you won't need them. And 9/11, obviously, they were ferrying people out of New York into New Jersey. But we have just about every single mode of transportation you can think of in my district, from ferry to light rail to cars, tunnels, bridges, you name it. But the ferry has been a very, very successful endeavor here in this district. My question is, what else can we do to improve ferry system in other areas of the country or in my area also? To anyone that wants to answer that question.
I think the question is addressed to any member on the panel.
Can you hear me?
Thank you, Congressman. I can tackle that one. I think that it's essential that we look at increasing funding. The ferry as a travel mode doesn't necessarily get the appreciation that it deserves. Mr. Principe pointed out that it can oftentimes be a much more efficient investment in terms of moving people, reducing congestion, addressing emissions than some other modes. So I think that it's worth exploring increasing funding opportunities. I also want to respond to the question about permitting issues. I think there are opportunities that we can look at to streamline permitting for projects and their expansion opportunities that all of us are looking at. There's a sequential approach to permitting between agencies these days instead of an approach that lets different regulatory agencies look at permits at the same time. That could really speed things up. We know time is money, and so that's another area that I think could be improved. Probably not just for ferries, but infrastructure generally.
Just like to add that because of the development that we have on the New Jersey side of the river, more and more people are coming from New York, live in New Jersey, and take the ferry into New York, which is compared to all the other modes of transportation, it really saves a great deal of time for these people because they could be home in half an hour, and that's unheard of in this area. Anybody who's ridden the New Jersey Turnpike and gone on the Lincoln Tunnel or the Holland Tunnel would know. You know, we have the tunnels, obviously. So I'm all for trying to help not just my area, but other areas, because I've seen the success of the ferry that is brought to this area. So let's keep funding, let's keep improving, because it's not only clean, it's an alternate way other than cost, because of the road, all those good things that ferries provide. You know, for many years, there was a lot of ferry activity here, and then it died off. But since all the development has happened, people are more and more interested in having ferries in their own towns, which takes them right into New York City. That's where the jobs are in this part of the state. Thank you. I don't have any further questions.
Congressman, let me just briefly respond to your question. We sympathize, our commuters here sympathize with the commuters in New York and New Jersey. We have very much the same type of traffic congestion as you do. And my hat's off to the committee for the passage of HR 2. HR 2 would have done great things for our ferry system here in the National Capital Region, including increased amount of funding opportunities and the ability to utilize some of that funding for operational purposes. The large drawback to the launch of ferry service, I believe, in this country is the inability to secure or guarantee an operating subsidy for, say, labor and fuel, the two largest expenses. And so without the ability to have an operating subsidy, it's difficult to attract the private sector to make that initial risk and take that initial responsibility of being able to start service. And then the other provision that we really liked in HR2 was the projects of national and regional significance, a separate pot of money for regional transportation systems that would benefit both of our areas.
Thank you very much. The next question will be from Mr. LaMalfa. You're recognized for 5 minutes, Mr. LaMalfa.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I appreciate the hearing here. We don't have a great amount of ferry activity in my district here, although I see my colleague, Mr. Garamendi, maybe we could reach an agreement on getting that one at Princeton to get service going between Butte and Colusa County going again. That helps save a lot of mileage for our farmers moving their machinery, as well as just a general commute, you would say, in that area. It was pretty handy back in the day, but so we understand the need, the importance, and I wanted to direct some questions towards Mr. Murphy on the Bay Area, where that's fairly proximate to our area, and what you're looking at. You know, we've used some of that service in the past as a tourist, mostly in the area. So when you talk about there's ridership currently on the system is about 40% of pre-COVID, and in seeking to restore service, how long do you think, that's probably pretty unpredictable, but to get back to 100% service, and also parallel that with what do you see, what do you know on bridge traffic for automobiles? Is that, what is the level of traffic for automobiles versus in bouncing back from the COVID era? Has it responded much more so than ferry service at a higher number than 40%?
Yeah, thank you, Congressman. It's a good question. We're seeing ridership levels at about 40% now. That's ahead of where we projected to be right now, even with the Delta variant impacts, which have had a significant impact on travel generally in the Bay Area. We think that we can get to 50%. That's what we budgeted for the current fiscal year, 50% of pre-COVID ridership by the end of June 2022. Our goal is to get back to somewhere in the area of 75% by the end of FY23. So we're looking at a 2 or 3 year recovery cycle before we can get back to 100%. There are still job and population growth is happening in the Bay Area.
Let me jump in. I'm sorry, his time is limited
Yeah.
here. What do you see? Do you have numbers for what bridge traffic is for automobiles?
They're back to pre-COVID levels. They're not focused on the commute period necessarily. They're spread out more across the day, which is what we're seeing on transit service as well. Off-peak service is more resilient than it was pre-COVID, but bridge traffic is back to 100% of pre-COVID levels.
What do you think the barrier is between people? It's not a lot of fun to go across the bridges during peak traffic there. Why isn't the ferry bouncing back more quickly? Why isn't it already at, say, 75%? Not pointing fingers at you, but just in general, why are not users jumping at that opportunity to have a shorter distance or a straighter travel?
Yeah, I think it's hard to say because the traffic is spread out over the day. We're not seeing the peak congestion time constraints, the travel times that we saw previously that were focused on the peak period. We know those are coming, but it's going to take downtown San Francisco largely reopening office-based jobs and employers there welcoming those commuters back to the office, which is looking like a January timeframe for the Bay Area.
That'll be tough. All right, talk about the retrofitting. Are we talking about brand new boats? Or are we talking about refitting current boats with the different propulsion system when you're talking about going to I guess diesel engines to zero emission electric? Are you utilizing? Do you see them utilizing the current craft or as a brand new craft?
We're looking at doing both. We're looking at buying some smaller vessels that are battery electric that would be able to operate some of our shorter routes. And we're looking at repowering our existing diesel vessels to be able to use zero emissions battery electric technology.
What do you think would be a projected cost on an average full-size diesel retrofit? And then how's that going to reflect in the price of the ticket, let's say?
We're assessing that now. There are some options for doing that. I can get back to you with more detail on the cost ranges for the retrofits. Our goal is to have it not affect the cost of a ticket at all. We would like to be able to use our local and regional matching funds to leverage federal programs that would be sufficient to be able to accommodate those costs and not have that trickle down to our fares at all.
Well, that would be a taxpayer expense then, unless somehow it was paying for itself. Is this a mandate, or is this something that you seek as a goal in order to, better public relations?
There is a mandate in California to reduce greenhouse gas emissions for commercial harbor craft. We're subject to that. There's a few ways to go about it. It doesn't require zero emission technology for any routes that are longer than 3 miles. Routes less than 3 miles are required to be zero emission. We're doing a little bit more on the zero emission side than what would be required by that regulation.
Okay, well, hopefully the one over to Oracle Park from across the bay is in that category of not having a retrofit, because I'd like to go over there and root for the Giants against the hated Southern California franchise. Anyway, so thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Lamalfa. Mr. Huffman, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Madam Chair, thanks for this important hearing, which comes obviously on the eve of the House potentially taking a vote this week on the Senate's infrastructure bill. As Chairman DeFazio has said, this bill was not written the right way. It came together in a back room written by a dozen pro-fossil fuel senators, and it has the oil industry's fingerprints all over it. Critical investments in tackling carbon emissions in the transportation sector were gutted from the House's Invest Act. And unfortunately, even when this bill tries to do something right, the Senate bill manages to get it wrong. So they included $1.2 billion in for public ferries, but the bill dedicates $1 billion of that to rural ferry services, excluding the rapidly growing ferry systems in California and other places. In fact, the FTA estimates that only 4 ferry services in the entire country would be eligible for the funding under this bill as it's currently written. But what came out of that backroom Senate deal is apparently sacred and unchangeable. We're told that we just have to live with what's in it, including the errors. There was a last-minute attempt to correct an error, increasing funding by $1.25 billion for the passenger ferry program, but the bill was rushed through without it. And here we are this week voting on a bill that not only includes giveaways to the fossil fuel industry, that not only underfunds critical climate priorities, but also just has errors and mistakes in it that we are told we cannot fix. And because of the double dipping promise that was made without any of us being party to it, it was impossible, unfortunately, even for this committee's reconciliation package to address the inequity in ferry funding. So, Mr. Murphy, I want to ask you about this. The Senate bill does increase funding nominally for the ferry formula program by about $30 million in the out years. How much does this actually increase funding for WETA?
Yeah, it's not much, Congressman. Thank you for the question. Thank you for your support of our system historically as well. But it's less than $1 million a year from that FHWA program. So the increase.
And remind me, how much does a new ferry boat cost you?
A new ferry boat is expensive. A small ferry boat is in the neighborhood of $4.3 million. The large ferry boats that we operate are 400 passenger, and those are upwards of $25 million.
Right. My understanding is that 35% of the allocation formula on this program is based on the number of vehicles carried by each ferry. The result being that funding is not as focused on helping remove vehicles from congested areas. That's what our Bay Area ferries actually do, but actually has a discriminatory effect on ferries like ours that move people rather than vehicles. Is that fair to say, Mr. Murphy?
That's correct. It's tough to make it easier to move cars on a boat in the Bay Area. We are more interested in moving people, and this program is focused on ferry vessels that move cars over longer distances.
And unlike the ferries in the Bay Area and other metropolitan areas, the ferry service in Alaska, though, will do very well under this backroom deal that came out of the Senate. They'll get an additional $12 million annually under the Senate bill because they cover very long distances and they move cars. And that's the way the deal was cooked. So, I tell you, I want to see support for rural communities. I want to see support for ferry service in rural communities, but not at the expense of major successful metropolitan area ferry programs like the one we have in the Bay Area. In fact, I look at this windfall to Alaska, and I see it on top of the new LNG facility that Senator Murkowski has achieved for herself with a $25 billion tax credit. And it sure looks like, they've said they're getting rid of earmarks, but this sure feels like a pretty generous earmark, at least a windfall. And we just shouldn't be doing that at the expense of urban communities, in my opinion. Ms. Rupstello, I want to ask you about your efforts to electrify or to go to hybrid electric and full electric vessels. What impact would the availability of those FTA urban ferry funds have on your system's ability to purchase these cleaner vessels and refurbish your fleet?
Well, we take full advantage of it. As I mentioned, we have conversions planned. So 3 existing boats that we want to convert. So we would utilize to the greatest extent possible on that. And then look at our shoreside infrastructure. That's a huge component to get the full benefit of going electric. And so we would focus a lot of the funding in that area as well.
Great. We've just got to make sure the formula makes those funds available to you. And we've got some work to do to get that fixed. So with that, I yield back. Thank you very much, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much, Mr. Huffman. I'm pleased to recognize now Mr. Burchett for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair Lady, and I guess technically I'm the ranking member right now, so your side has had adequate leadership. Ours has been woefully underserved up to this point, especially since my buddy Rodney Davis was sitting up here. But Mr. Murphy, prior to the pandemic, 60% of WETA's operating costs were covered by fares. What percent of funding was provided by the state and local governments, and what percent came from federal sources?
Our operating budget, the remaining subsidy was provided largely by bridge tolls collected in the Bay Area.
Okay, thank you. And this is for anybody and everybody, I guess. Do you have any suggestions for boosting the ridership and making ferry systems more financially independent? This is a chance.
Congressman, I'll jump in on that. The stakeholder group has conducted a number of technical studies, including a market analysis here in this region. And we concluded that the 2 most important issues for a rider is time and cost. And to the extent that a trip takes longer than, say, a single occupancy vehicle or another mode of transit, they're not going to select a ferry service as their way into work. And then cost, passenger ticket cost. While we have a very high cost of living here in the region, prospective passengers would be unwilling to pay a ticket cost if it were costing more than their individual trip, which in Washington, D.C. requires another $20 or $25 on top of the cost in order to park.
Okay.
So I'd like to add on to that. I agree at the concern about increasing the cost to the point where somebody doesn't want to take the ferry is of concern. But the other thing, what we've been able to do in the urban area is be able to connect the transit system to our ferry system, so people have that as an option. In the rural areas, we struggle on that. And so having more support on funding those first mile, last mile connections, I think will really help increase that walk-on passenger capacity.
Anyone else?
Mr. Burchett, she said funding funding the two systems. I didn't understand how they do that.
Okay, ma'am, could you
Connecting the two systems.
explain that to us?
Sure. You know, in the urban area where we have transit systems that are already there, easy connections. So we've created essentially transit hubs at some of our terminal locations. So someone can walk off our ferry and hop right onto a bus or a commuter rail. In the more rural areas, having that infrastructure is the only way you're going to increase the ridership on the vessels, on the ferries for walk-on passengers, is having that transit component available to the user.
That makes sense to you, Chair Lady? All right.
Yeah, with no new fare, but then they pay a new fare to get onto the new system, to another system.
That is true. However, in our region, we have a one payment system, so it makes it very streamlined and easy for a passenger to go from one system to the next.
We good?
Yes.
All right, well, thank y'all very much. And where I live in East Tennessee, to be honest with you, the only ferries that are there are just historic markers. Most of them were sunk a little bit after the Civil War or during the Civil War. So this has been very educational to me. So thank you, Chair Lady.
Do you have waterways?
Oh, TVA, we've got them all over. It's just that we just don't have a lot of ferries there. There's a lot of roads named after them, and they just end at the lake usually, oddly enough. And they pick up on the other side. So that's the history of it. But thank you, Chair Lady.
Thank you very much, Mr. Burchett. I now recognize Mr. Garamendi for 5 minutes. Mr. Garamendi, you are recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Huffman covered much of what I wanted to discuss, but I want to carry it a little bit further and particularly talk to Mr. Murphy about the Bay Area. The WIDA program in the Bay Area is part of, but not all of, the ferry system. There's also private ferries operating in the Bay Area. Mr. Murphy, could you discuss their role in providing the transportation needs of the area?
Sure. Yeah, there are a number of private operators. WIDA uses one of those operators as our contract operator, Blue and Gold Fleet. There are some other operators providing service to employers who contract for that service to connect their employees specifically, not a public ferry system, but connect their employees to their campuses. They also provide some charter service throughout the Bay Area when needed. We've been looking for opportunities to partner with those private operators and explore ways that we can utilize the infrastructure that they have to be able to pilot different services that are public. We're in the middle of developing those plans now.
Very good. We've also had, so as we proceed with legislation to correct the problems that the Senate has given America with their bipartisan infrastructure plan, we should keep in mind the role of private ferries throughout this. There's also something that will come up, I believe, in the Coast Guard reauthorization having to do with the financing authority. This is the Capital Construction Fund for ferries. Presently, it only applies to ferries that carry cars or other kinds of cargo. It does not speak to passenger ferries alone, so we need to correct that over in the Coast Guard reauthorization. The other issues, Mr. Murphy, we discussed this, but I don't think thoroughly, and that has to do with the transition from fossil fuel power to other kinds of power. We discussed this a little. What do you need in federal law to complete that, keeping in mind that we had tried to do that in the House Invest Act? Mr. Murphy might want to do that, and also Ms. Rubenstello.
Yeah, thank you, Congressman, and appreciate your support for making our ferry system cleaner in the Bay Area. We are looking to do that, to convert a large portion of our system to battery electric technology. There may be opportunities down the road to use hydrogen technology. That's something we're exploring as well. The thing we need is two things. One is we need robust federal funding to support the costs associated with making that transition to match our local and regional and state sources, which do exist. And the other thing that we need is we need the industry to continue to innovate in that area, to compete with diesel technology and the travel times, the trip lengths that can be accommodated by diesel fuel, battery electric and hydrogen technology just needs to continue to advance.
Okay, so specifically, you'll need federal support to achieve that transition. Just a quick point, we also often talk about subsidies here. Let's keep in mind that the entire highway system for automobiles and trucks is very heavily subsidized along the way. Now, with regard to the question of the federal formula for public ferry service, how does the current formula disadvantage public ferry services in the Bay Area? And perhaps we've covered part of that with the passenger ferries being discriminated against with car ferries. So Ms. Rubenstello, if you'd like to chime in on both of these questions, the former one as well as the current one.
Yes, thank you for that. I just echo what Mr. Murphy mentioned. I mean, certainly having additional federal support for the ferry system is necessary, as well as the innovation on technology, and not just on our vessels themselves, but also that shoreside power source. It's important to have those be as cost effective and innovative as well. And I apologize, I forgot your second question.
It's okay, you basically covered it, and we're going to run out of time in a few seconds.
Okay.
The other thing is, in the INVEST Act, we purposely connected all transportation programs, whether it be a truck terminal or a ferry terminal, to the land base and to other transportation systems. I would note that that is not in the Senate bill. It's something we're going to have to continue to work with so that we make sure that there is the connectivity which several of you have discussed. With that, my time is expired, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Garamendi. I'll call on next Ms. Bordeaux. Ms. Bordeaux, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Oh, Madam, I yield back my, I did not. I did not prepare 5 minutes of talking points. Great to be here, and I appreciate the chance to be a part of this hearing.
Thank you, Ms. Bordeaux.
And I yield back. Thank you.
Mr. Moulton? Wait a minute. Mr. Carbajal, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My question is for Mr. Murphy. The transportation sector is one of the largest emitters of harmful greenhouse gas emissions. In 2019, 29% from modes of transportation. Can you discuss the benefits of transitioning to zero emissions?
Sure. Yeah, it's critical to our climate goals. Transportation as an industry is responsible, as you say, for a large portion of greenhouse gas emissions. We have to keep trying to make it cleaner. That has been one of the criticisms of water transit service in the past, is that the emissions are a challenge to be able to address. There are ways to clean up diesel fuel. We're the first passenger ferry agency to install Tier 4 engines, which on our system reduces 10 tons of greenhouse gas emissions every year. So there are improvements to make in that area, but ultimately we need to look at moving to zero emissions technology to make sure that our climate goals can be achieved.
Mr. Murphy, how can Congress better support programs that move us towards a cleaner future?
Yeah, thank you. I think, one of the things we've talked about here is the inequities of the FHWA program and the way that It addresses the funding needs for some ferry systems, but not others. If you're a passenger ferry-based system like WIDA that doesn't carry cars and operates over some relatively short routes, still long enough to be able to accomplish some dramatic greenhouse gas reduction goals, but not as long as what is rewarded by the FHWA program. We need to look to the FTA program. The FTA program is focused on funding systems like ours that meet our characteristics, that operate in urban areas over short distances, carry passengers. And we just need to increase funding for that program to make sure that resources are available. We were happy that a technical corrections amendment was ready to go in the Senate. We know we couldn't get it done in reconciliation, and so there are other avenues that we're hoping the committee can explore to make sure that we add that funding back in.
Thank you. Ms. Rupstello, as we look towards decarbonizing our future and begin to tackle the climate crisis, we often focus on transitioning our fleets towards zero emissions. However, charging stations and infrastructure are also needed to fulfill our visions towards lowering our carbon footprint. Can you discuss your plans further about for terminal charging infrastructure and how Congress can help support these efforts?
Yes, thank you for that question. Yes, the shoreside power is very vital to ensuring that we get the most benefit out of converting our fleet to hybrid electric. We've been working with our power suppliers in our region. We're looking at providing at 16 of our terminals the necessary infrastructure. And so being able to ensure that the federal funding supports that is vital for us to get that full benefit of our conversion program.
Thank you. Madam Chair, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Carbajal, for your questions. I now recognize Mr. Moulton for 5 minutes. Mr. Moulton, you are recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to all the witnesses who are here. My district on the North Shore of Massachusetts benefits from some limited ferry service, which is very popular, but we've also had an experience where we've started some ferry service on a trial basis that wasn't continued by the state. It's very much missed in the city of Lynn, for example. The city of Salem is looking to expand the ferry service it already has. But we are very concerned about the climate implications. We also have very good commuter rail service. It's not a regional rail, but it's very popular. We're looking to electrify that. As we think about electrifying our ferries and moving to zero emissions service, how do you have to adapt the service to accommodate that? Do you have to provide for charging time at docks? Do you have to, what sort of infrastructure investments are you looking at? How do we need to think about the changes we would have to make to the existing service to accommodate zero emissions vehicles? And I guess actually that's a good, sorry, I didn't direct that to anyone in particular, but I don't know if Mr. Murphy, you'd like to respond, or Ms. Rupstello, whoever would like to jump in there.
I can start. It is a big challenge. We're studying it right now. We have a shoreside infrastructure study that is looking at all of the technology that's available and applying different options to our system to see how we might need to adapt our services. Our goal is not to have to adapt much at all in terms of travel time and scheduling and frequency, but the reality is it might take a little longer to charge depending on what you can afford to install at the shoreside. If you can't afford rapid charging infrastructure, which is more expensive, then that slow trickle charge might mean that your boats are parked at the dock for a little bit longer. Sometimes they might need to charge overnight for a number of hours before they're ready to operate again. So that is a trade-off, but there is technology that exists. It's more expensive, but it can rapidly charge boats at the dock during dwell time without sacrificing much in terms of schedule or frequency.
And Mr. Murphy, just as a realistic goal, when do you think you'll be able to transition to this new zero emissions technology? Is this something that can be accomplished in the next few years, or is it realistically 10 or 15 years out?
We can begin to phase this technology in the next few years. We have a state grant to buy what would be the region's first high-speed passenger all-electric vessel. That grant comes with some funding to install some shoreside infrastructure. We've just applied or will be applying for the FTA discretionary program for another couple of vessels to serve new neighborhoods on the San Francisco Bayfront. They will also be all electric, so we're starting to move in that direction. But if the FTA program was funded at 1.25 billion over the next 5 years, I would say we'd be able to make a really significant amount of progress over that time period and get to our 50% conversion over that time period if those funding levels existed.
Assistant Secretary Robstello, tell me how you think about balancing your funding priorities between converting existing vehicles to low emissions or even adding frequencies on existing routes versus starting new routes. That's something that we are trying to figure out in our community.
Well, right now we're really focused on how we make our current routes as efficient and effective as possible. So that's where we spend our time focused on that. And as it relates to the conversion side, we're just so happen at a time with our current vessels, the three that I mentioned that we are going to do a conversion on is, it just so happens they're at their midlife overhaul for those engines. And so it's just the right time to make that conversion happen.
I mentioned the city of Lynn experimented with city ferry service a couple of years ago. It seemed very popular, but didn't quite have the ridership that they were hoping for. The proponents said, look, you just need to give it time. What are other things that we should think about in terms of encouraging ridership and getting people to make the switch so that it can be proven?
Well, I would say it's a couple different things. One is, what are those other connections that are available to them so that they can get to where they need to go if your focus is for them not to be utilizing their cars. The other thing is what's the development around those terminal locations? And so how does that support those trips that customers are wanting to take?
Those are great things to think about. Thank you, Madam Chair. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Moulton, for those questions. I now recognize Mr. Desaulniers for 5 minutes. Mr. Desaulniers, you are now recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. Thank you for this hearing. Mr. Murphy, having had a long history with the ferries in the San Francisco Bay Area, particularly the commutes from the East Bay into the ferry building. We've made good progress, but as I remember my time on the Metropolitan Planning Organization and MTC, the modeling in the 80 corridor, and for those of you who aren't familiar with it, it's our most congested part of the San Francisco Bay Area, across the Richmond Bridge in my district and then across the Bay Bridge. Modeling was always a challenge, and we'd like to be more like Seattle and get the ridership up. But maybe you can talk a little bit about how ferries can make an obvious difference, and particularly to communities that don't non-transit dependent or transit dependent communities, like the community I represent that now has a ferry that goes from Richmond into the ferry building. Maybe talk a little bit about those challenges of the measurability in high congested corridors and moving them off. And we have a perfect example. The Bay Bridge is I think it's the second busiest toll bridge in the United States. How do we move traffic? And we can't build more infrastructure in there. It's prohibitive. And of course, we've got the problem of induced demand. So we've struggled in this area, and I know other urban areas have. How do you do the modeling that shows that people can get off, and it's not just exclusively people of means, that we also reach out to people who historically have been transit dependent and find it difficult to be able to take water transport?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thank you for a long history of support for public transit in the Bay Area. It's a tough question. There are a number of aspects to it. One thing we know we need to do to address congestion, though, is that we need to attract choice riders. We need to make sure that that people who have the option to drive are choosing to take public transit, in this case, ferries instead. That means we need to make our service relevant to their needs. We need to go where they want to go. It needs to be frequent enough. The convenience factor needs to be very high. Ms. Rubstello brought up first last mile connections a few times now. That's critical to ferry service. We're a regional connection, but we can't necessarily solve that first last mile unless we work with our partners who run buses, shuttles, employers to operate dedicated shuttles to first and last mile locations. We have some transit network company TNC partnerships where we make it affordable for folks to use TNCs to solve that first last mile commute, ideally with a carpool situation. For transit dependent riders, the fact is people paid a premium for ferry service prior to the pandemic. We were higher than other transit modes, and that created a have and have not situation. We have addressed that with our pandemic recovery program. We've lowered our fares to be in alignment with other transit modes that operate in the same corridor. We don't want riders to have to choose one system over another because of price. We want to make sure they're choosing a system that works best for them. And it's up to us to make it affordable and to make sure that it's relevant and actually does work best for their commute needs. Off-peak service has been a real boon for our system during the pandemic recovery. It's been the most resilient part of our system, and we think that's because transit-dependent workers are likely to be traveling during the off-peak to shift work, for example. So those are a few things we need to do, and there are more, I'm certain.
And you bring up a good point with the history is, I mean, of course, your agency started with the idea, I remember then the president of the state senate after Loma Prieta, that we couldn't be dependent on our bridges because we're in a seismic area. And then of course we've learned we have to be more resilient in other regards. I was wondering if Ms. Rubistello, you could comment on your history or any of the other panelists around performance. It goes a little bit to the air quality issues. You know, we want to get those tons down. We want to get the system as good as possible when it comes to traditional pollutants and carbon, but also the equity issues and the social justice issues. Ms. Rubistello.
Yeah, definitely on the social justice issues. It's really about having that reliable service, and we hear across the board that that's what's most important to people. It's that reliability, because not showing up to work is a paycheck you're not collecting. So that's important. One thing that we were hoping to start last year before the pandemic hit was a low-income fare option. That's something we currently don't have, but that's something that we want to consider. And so that's something we're looking forward to getting started soon to see how we can further support those users that are out there.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Desaulniers. Mr. Garamendi just mentioned to me hydrogen generation as an important way to fuel the ferry. We use it in our cars. I have one that uses it now. So I would like the record, since he didn't get an opportunity to ask that question, I would like to get his mention of that in the record. And now I am pleased to recognize Mr. Auchincloss. You are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman, for holding this hearing to review the importance of investments in our ferry system to improve mobility for all people. And to the witnesses, thank you for participating. In Massachusetts, commuters rely on MBTA ferries to get to work in Boston from the South Shore and to circumvent a horrendously congested vehicular traffic route. Island residents rely on ferries not only for tourism revenue, but also as a lifeline for emergency services, food, medicine, and other essential equipment. Ms. Rubstello, you discuss how Washington State ferries are working to comply with Governor Inslee's goal of a zero emissions fleet. Transportation in Massachusetts is the largest single source of carbon emissions. And as you mentioned, the Washington State ferries diesel fuel consumption makes it the largest generator of carbon and other greenhouse gas emissions from Washington State government. How long do you think it's going to take to fully transition to a hybrid electric fleet, and what can the federal government be doing to help meet that goal?
Thank you for that question. Well, part of our long-range plan looked at how long it would take, and we think it's going to take 20 years to build out our fleet to be completely hybrid electric. So as our old vessels are coming due, we would just rebuild them or build new ones to replace them, as well as I mentioned earlier, the conversion of our 3 larger vessels that are ready for midterm overhauls. So the way the federal government can help is the funding side of it. I mentioned, not only from the conversion side, but we need on the shore side, the funding support to build that infrastructure that then can fully have those vessels be electric.
Thank you. And Mr. Garamendi, if you're interested, I'm happy to yield the rest of my time to you if you wanted to ask questions about hydrogen or make any comments about hydrogen.
Mr. Auchincloss, that's very generous of you. I believe that there is a ferry system in the Bay Area that's looking at this hydrogen very seriously. Hydrogen being available from the various refineries in the area, and then using a fuel cell to generate the electricity for the propellant to propel the ferry. I believe, Mr. Murphy, you're aware of this and working with, is it the Red and White Fleet that is working on this? And if you'd care to comment on the potential for it. Also, in the Bay Area and really around the nation, there are fuel cell companies that are rapidly developing very powerful fuel cells. So, Mr. Murphy.
Yeah, thank you, Congressman. There are some operators who have invested in a hydrogen vessel that would be a great demonstration project in the Bay Area. It's called the Sea Change. And would be the first application of its kind. We're looking forward to seeing what happens with that. We will be involved in, to some extent, how that vessel is operating, at least from an analysis standpoint, and maybe more. But hydrogen has a lot of potential on longer routes to be a zero-emission mode of choice, a zero-emission propulsion technology of choice, where electric technology can't quite provide enough of a charge to achieve a longer route and the speeds necessary to make the travel time accommodated for a longer route. Hydrogen is more robust in terms of being able to provide that application.
And it's a technology that's readily available today. It's a matter of making it applicable to the ferry system. I wanted to get this on the record. Once again, the federal government can help with all of these technologies and the transition from the carbon-based systems that are presently used to these zero-emission systems. That takes us back to the INVEST Act, where most of this was already included. I thank the chairwoman for making it possible in the INVEST Act, if only the Senate, which seems to be the mantra that we're singing so often here. With that, Mr. Auchincloss, thank you for the time. Thank you.
I appreciate the line of questioning from my colleague, and Madam Chairwoman, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Auchincloss and Mr. Garamendi. I now recognize Mr. Johnson for 5 minutes. Mr. Johnson, you are recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair, for holding this hearing, and thank you to the witnesses for your time and your testimony. Ferries have long served a historic role in transportation throughout America, including in my home city of Atlanta, where they once enabled residents to cross the Chattahoochee River. Today, ferries still provide critical services in places like Staten Island, New Orleans, and San Francisco. What's more, ferries reduce our carbon emissions and alleviate congestion on roadways. For all of these benefits, ferries are vital to our efforts to combat climate change and should be incorporated in our infrastructure modernization plans. Mrs. Rupstello, you explained how the pandemic led you to increase recruitment and workforce development efforts for maritime professionals. What outreach have you conducted to ensure equal opportunity employment for Black American workers, people of color, and women?
Thank you for that question. It's definitely been a challenge for us. Pre-pandemic, we were much more engaged in the various communities that you mentioned to recruit into the industry. We've been just challenged on the recruitment front with the pandemic, just dealing with all the challenges of students working or doing school from home and that sort of stuff. But we are ramping that back up again and looking at every opportunity to get into those communities. I also note that our region, we have a high school that's just started up that's focused on the maritime industry. So students going through high school are learning about what the industry offers and getting some training so that they're ready to step into those roles when they get out of high school. So that's a good effort that's underway, and we look forward to additional schools like that to grab students at the high school level and bring them into our industry.
Thank you. How does the cost of higher education, licensing, and entrant qualifications hinder equal opportunity, and how can Congress help mitigate the high costs?
Yeah, there's definitely cost for just getting in at the lowest level. Everything from the security requirements that they have to go through, the training that has to be done before they even have a job. And so supporting those training efforts, subsidizing those expenses so that those who don't have the means can pay for daycare and can pay for their lunches while they're at training. So any program that can support that is much appreciated.
Thank you. As the maritime industry continues to expand, what plans are in place to ensure community preservation of minority neighborhoods surrounding ports?
Well, I think a big piece for us is around our going to hybrid electric because of the demographics of, especially in the Seattle area. We know we have lower income people living closer to our port and marine industries. And so the more we can be greener and lower impact on the environment, it's best for the communities around us.
Well, how about to actually preserve the presence of those neighborhoods surrounding ports to ensure that they are not, those people are not displaced?
We don't have any issues with displacement, but I think supporting the network, the transportation network, so that those communities have easy access to good jobs and the services that they need is really important.
Thank you. What immediate environmental improvements do you anticipate by converting your fleet's vessels from diesel to hybrid electric propulsion? And how does that speak to long-term emissions trends in, in the maritime industry? And you just alluded to that.
Yeah, and I'll just highlight, just in the conversion, as I mentioned, our 3 largest vessels, which produce the most amount of greenhouse gases, converting those is going to improve our emissions by 27%. And that equates to removing the equivalent of 10,000 cars off the road. So just with 3 vessel conversions, we're going to have a huge impact to greenhouse gas emissions in our region.
Thank you. And lastly, your testimony points to the public-private military partnership for the construction and operating of new transit service. How are you incorporating outreach to minority-owned businesses, for example, those from the Disadvantaged Business Enterprise Program?
Sure,
Yeah,
Congressman. Go ahead.
Go ahead. Oh, I was just going to mention that we in our state have a very robust program to do an outreach and kind of even a peer-to-peer kind of process to grow that industry for the maritime industry. I apologize.
Thank you. And with that, I yield back. I'm out of time.
Thank you, Mr. Johnson. I now recognize Mr. Lynch. Mr. Lynch, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I really do appreciate it. I want to thank the panelists for their good work on this issue. I represent the Port of Boston, so not quite as bad congestion-wise as Mr. Sears is having in New Jersey, but we consider our ferry system a real blessing. This past August, I think we are up around 3,000 ferry trips in that month, which is about a 300% increase from last year when we were really dealing with COVID in a more serious way. Ms. Robstello, I was very interested in your mentioning of converting the diesel ferries to electric. And I've been following this pretty closely. I actually had a bill that dealt with converting diesel buses in the transportation bill and converting the entire postal fleet to electric. So I'm very much aware of the obstacles and what that'll involve, but I'm also keenly aware of the benefits that would bring. And in the Boston area, our port area, I represent the coast from the north end of Boston in the city all the way down to Situate. So that whole area is heavily impacted by the ferry system. And as others have said, and you have said already, it takes tens of thousands of cars off the road. It opens up the waterfront. We've got an island system that is pristine off the coast. And so I'm just wondering, how far along is the battery technology, and are we incorporating that idea in our ferry manufacturing system? Are we anticipating and moving away from, building more diesel-powered ferries, or are we sort of anticipating the future and trying to capitalize on the opportunity to go electric, if you will?
Thank you for that question. Yeah, I mean, I think the industry is ripe for it. Obviously, Norway's kind of leading the charge. So from an international perspective, it's growing. And our local industry, there's a lot of emphasis on the innovation around the battery concept. And we've been working very closely with our local power providers, Seattle City Light, to find the most creative ways we can get the energy that we need to deal with our hybrid vessels. So I think it's great timing. I think we're poised for it. Unfortunately, I think funding keeps us from going faster and getting it implemented sooner.
Right. Thank you. In closing, I just want to say that we're also grappling with shore power. So I know in Red Hook, in Brooklyn, that they've begun a process of, when they bring in their luxury liners, they're able to just hook up to shore power, and they're not blowing diesel out the stack while they're in port to run their operations. And there seems to be an overlap here where bringing shore power to major port cities across the country, and the idea of going electric with our ferry systems, there seems to be a certain harmony there. And I'm just wondering if we might be able to piggyback those efforts in terms of funding, because you're right, the gap here has been a lack of resources, not a lack of imagination or a lack of awareness of the problems that climate change bring, but there's a reluctance in, I guess, prioritizing that within the menu of responsibilities that we have here on the Transportation Committee. But I want to thank the chair, and I want to thank the full committee chair, Mr. DeFazio, because he has been an outstanding champion of expanding and improving upon our ferry systems, not only in the port cities of this country, but also our riverine communities as well, where the ferry systems are equally as important. So with that, Madam Chair, I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lynch. I now recognize Ms. Napolitano. Ms. Napolitano, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, I really don't have ferries in my district. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I am happy to hear what the other mode of transportation needs are and how we can help. It is important for us. And I would like to yield time to Mr. Garamendi if he so needs it. I guess not. John?
He is not here at the moment.
Okay, well, I just wanted to say that it is important for us to hear what the issues are and what the conversion to electric batteries. We have the same problem in buses, so we have to be sure we include all modes of transportation in our committees and that we know what those issues are so that we can go ahead and do something to help the rest of the travelers be able to go to work or to go to medical appointments, etc. And I thank you very much. I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Napolitano. Let me thank each of the witnesses for your testimony today. Your comments have been very informative and helpful indeed. I noted in my opening remarks that this was the very first hearing ever had in the Congress on water transportation. Now that really says something. I don't know whether the era of climate change has brought us to understand that we've got to use every form of transportation, but particularly forms of transportation that do not contribute or contribute less to climate change. I think the testimony today has shown that water transportation has been too unrecognized and maybe even unused by the Congress. I ask unanimous consent that the record of today's hearing remain open until such time as our witnesses have provided answers to any questions that may be submitted to them in writing. I also ask unanimous consent that the record remain open for 15 days for any additional comments and information submitted by members or witness responses to be included in the record of today's hearing. Without objection, so ordered. The subcommittee hearing is adjourned.